Hello everybody and welcome back to another Know Your Ship episode with Chase, and today we are going to talk about the Japanese carriers of the Shokaku class, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, two of the premier Japanese carriers of the Second World War. The Shokaku class was designed when the Washington Naval Treaty expired in December of 1936. Japanese designers were finally liberated of all the constraints placed upon them by the treaty. All prior Japanese carriers had to adhere to the limitations placed on them by that treaty. The Shokaku class, they were free from those particular constraints. They were now free, essentially, to design as good of a ship as they possibly could. Particular emphasis was placed upon protection, speed, operational range, and aircraft carrying capacity. The Shokaku class of carriers were incredibly fast. They were able to zip along at 34.2 knots maximum on 160,000 shaft horsepower. Also had great range, 18,000 kilometers at 18 knots. They also carried a good number of planes, 72 aircraft in total with 12 spares. Now, unlike earlier Japanese carriers, these 12 spares could actually be readied quite quickly, because on the previous carriers, they were always carried in disassembled states, so a lot of time had to be used to actually assemble them. On the Shokaku class, they were very easy to get ready and put into action. In terms of protection, the Shokaku class was pretty good, actually. They were the first carrier class in the Imperial Japanese Navy to have a torpedo defense system. Now, in terms of the ships themselves, the Shokaku class was unrivaled by any other carrier class in the world until the arrival of the Essex class carriers in 1943. However, Japanese failings in a number of other things would prove disastrous not only for the Shokaku class of carriers, but the entire Japanese Navy. One of the major differences between the Japanese carriers and comparable US carriers like the Yorktown and Essex is the way that they dealt with airplane servicing and storage. The US Navy adopted the approach where planes would be serviced and stored on the decks and the hangar. This led to US carriers being designed with one large open hangar, and in the event that, for example, the aviation gas storage tanks ruptured, or those fuel lines ruptured, and fumes started entering the ships, the US carriers could just open up the hangar area and vent the gas that way. Furthermore, planes parked on the deck could easily be pushed overboard if it was a danger to the ship itself. The Japanese Navy, on the other hand, well, they opted to have something kind of different. They opted to have all the storage and the servicing done in the hangars. This led to a different design. First of all, they got two hangars instead of one, and these were closed-off hangars. Now, this had a couple of flaws too. Now, one of the major flaws is, of course, if you store everything inside hangars, there is only that much space, and so for a ship this size, having two hangars and nothing on the deck meant that they did carry fewer aircraft compared to the US carriers at around that period of time. The other problem really had to do with whether the ship was able to deal with certain kinds of battle damage. Now, the hangar decks on the Shokaku class ships were designed so that the force of a bomb explosion would be vented outwards to the side. Instead, in real life, the opposite often happened. A single bomb hitting the hangar area would actually take out the flight deck, as the explosive force was actually pushed up through the deck, ruining it completely. Aside from the two hangar design not really being the best choice, there was another much more critical design flaws on pretty much all Japanese carriers, and it has to do with the storage of aviation gas. And this particular flaw exists on the Shokaku class as well. And that is the fact that the Japanese made their aviation gas storage tanks an integral part of the ship's structure. Now, this means that when the ship took hits from torpedoes, it, very likely could have led to ruptured fuel lines, leading to fuel vapor spreading across the ship, and where the smallest of sparks would set it off. Now, this was also not helped by the fact that the hangar area, like I mentioned earlier, was a closed-off area. The only ventilation was done by intakes and exhaust fans, which were far less efficient in an event of an emergency. Now, this particular flaw contributed to the Shokaku sinking, but of course is also quite famous for the sinking of the Japanese carrier Taiho to a single torpedo hit. This problem wasn't only isolated to the Imperial Japanese Navy. The US Navy, at least their early carriers, were not immune from this threat. So USS Lexington, CV-2, was lost in similar set of circumstances after the Battle of the Coral Sea. On top of all of these things, do keep in mind as well that the aircraft just couldn't be pushed overboard, right? In order to get rid of aircraft, they had to push it to an elevator and elevate the aircraft to the deck and then push them overboard. So in the event that the elevators were taken out, for example, and if the planes became a threat to the ship, there was just no real way to get rid of them. So all this combined, and then on top of all that, right, the abysmal quality of Japanese damage control and the recipe was set for carriers being lost to sometimes pitiful amounts of initial damage. Another technological shortcoming had to do with radar. The lack of radar on board Japanese ships cost the Imperial Japanese Navy dearly, most notably during the Battle of Midway. The Shokaku was actually the very first carrier in the Japanese fleet to receive a radar set, a Type 21 set, in the later half of 1942. Yet even with radar, the Japanese Navy were not really able to maximize their forces because they just didn't have that central coordination that you would find on board US ships in the form of the Combat Information Center. Shokaku's radar did save the ship during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, where very early warning of an incoming American strike wave allowed the crew to empty the fuel lines of fuel, thereby preventing fuel line ruptures from leaking sort of aviation gas fumes everywhere into the hangar. Still, having radar wasn't enough to prevent the Shokaku from taking serious damage from US bombers on numerous occasions. This can partially be attributed to the absolutely pathetic AA that was found on board Japanese ships. Now, the two carriers of the Shokaku class actually had really heavy anti-aircraft armament compared to other ships. There were 16 127mm guns in 8 dual turrets, which were okay in terms of performance, but they were really let down by a lack of decent fire control and a lack of proximity fuses. The light anti-aircraft weapons, they were plentiful, but performance of those light anti-aircraft guns in the Japanese Navy was awful, just absolutely abysmal. By 1943, Shokaku had 70 25mm guns, but if you know anything about history, those 25mm guns were just awful by any stretch of the imagination. Zuikaku, the Shokaku's sister ship, survived a bit longer, so she actually topped out at 96 25mm guns and even 6 28-barrel 4.7-inch rocket launchers to try to deter dive bombers. None of the anti-aircraft equipment were really all that effective, and of course that combined with the lack of centralized control did not help the situation. Now, the two ships were completed within 2 months of each other. Shokaku on August the 8th of 1941, Zuikaku September 25th, 1941. The two ships would form the 5th Carrier Division assigned to the 1st Air Fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. At the time of the Pearl Harbor attacks, the two carriers of the Shokaku class each carried 18 Zeros, 27 Vals, and 27 Kates. As they were relatively new to the fleet, the Shokaku and Zuikaku's planes were mainly tasked with attacking the airfields around Pearl Harbor, while the more experienced aircrew from the other carriers like the Kaga and the Akagi were responsible for attacking the ships. By all accounts, the aircrew of the Shokaku and Zuikaku did reasonably well during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Before the next major operation, the Shokaku and Zuikaku participated in the Indian Ocean raids along with the rest of the 1st Air Fleet. Now, they were able to sink, amongst other things, 2 heavy cruisers, HMS Cornwall and Dorsetshire, of Hunt of Bismarck fame, and the carrier HMS Hermes. On the way back to Japan from the Indian Ocean raids, the 5th Carrier Division was redirected to support the invasion of Port Moresby. It was around this area in May of 1942 that the first major carrier-on-carrier engagement occurred, and it would have some pretty dire consequences for the Imperial Japanese Navy. During the Battle of the Coral Sea, aircraft from the Shokaku and Zuikaku were responsible for the sinking of the USS Lexington, CV-2, and damaging the USS Yorktown. The Shokaku herself did not escape damage, taking 3 bomb hits from US aircraft. This put her out of action for the next 3 months. Still, this was not nearly as bad as some of the aircraft losses that the Japanese suffered. By the end of the battle, the two carriers had only 24 Zeros, 8 dive bombers, and 4 torpedo planes operational. The two carriers had lost a combined total of 92 aircraft. Now, due to the way that the Imperial Japanese Navy handled aircrew training and how they dealt with lost aircraft and crews, the seemingly small number of lost aircraft and crews was set the stage for the decisive Battle of Midway. Now, I'm going to go off on a bit of a small tangent here, because no matter how excellent the ship, poor decisions by people in charge can ultimately cost a country a war. Now, unlike the US Navy, the Japanese Navy of the Second World War was at times a very, very inflexible institution. This combined with what can best be described as some of the senior staff being quite drunk on victory led to some pretty atrocious planning for what would turn out to be a major turning point in the war. On May the 1st, 1942, and this is before the Battle of the Coral Sea, which would start a few days later, the senior staff played a series of war games on board the Yamato in preparation for Midway. The point of war games is to identify problems and figure out how to solve those problems. However, from the get-go, the entire war game was a farce. Admiral Yamamoto's chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, played the role of the umpire, and he would just kind of gloss over events to suit a nicer narrative. In one instance, while playing through a scenario about the potential impact of land-based bombers, a dice roll indicated that 9 bomb hits were scored and both the Akagi and Kaga had been sunk. Admiral Ugaki at the time personally intervened to revise the number down to only 3 bomb hits, and only 1 carrier being sunk. One must at times wonder if the senior staff were just completely delusional or something, because when Yamamoto asked, for example, what would happen if the enemy carrier force were to appear on the flanks, he kind of got a response that because of superior Japanese defensive power and it being totally unbreakable, the matter was of small concern, which, you kind of expect that answer from an amateur, not a professional officer. So anyways, 2 days after the war games concluded, news arrived with regards to the state of the Shokaku and Zuikaku after the Battle of the Coral Sea. Suddenly, the first air fleet, well, they were down to only 4 fleet carriers for the Midway operation. You think that someone at the time would kind of just go, wait a second, when we planned the operation, we'd have all 6 carriers, now we only have 4, maybe we should go back and re-examine this. Nothing of the sort happened at all. The fact that numerical superiority could no longer be guaranteed was just swept under the rug, and the operation continued without any further analysis. To get a feeling of how big the difference this would have been, the initial plan would have allowed the Japanese fleet to approach Midway with 6 fleet carriers, bomb the island, dealing with enemy carriers that pop up with whatever, with a combined air wing of around 123 Zeros, 126 D-3A dive bombers, and 135 B-5N torpedo bombers, assuming, again, you're having like Pearl Harbor numbers for the Shokaku and the Zuikaku. And this would compare to only 88 F-4F Wildcats, 129 Dauntless dive bombers, 44 Devastators, 6 Avengers, 4 Marauders, and 19 Flying Fortresses. Instead, when the number dropped to only 4 fleet carriers, the drop in terms of attacking power is quite substantial. All of a sudden, you're down to only 87 Zeros, 72 D-3As, and 81 B-5Ns. Now, remember, I was talking about the inflexibility of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Well, here's another example of it. In the US Navy, if aircrew were lost, pilots from other squadrons or other carriers would be transferred in. This meant that if a ship was needed for combat and the aircrew numbers weren't really there, they would just bring them in from other ships and would make up those numbers. At least you'd have an operational carrier. For the Japanese Navy, the flight crews were considered to be tied to the carrier, so even though the Zuikaku herself wasn't damaged, well, it was pulled out of action until its aircrew could be reconstituted, instead of simply, let's say, transferring in pilots from the Shokaku and some of the light carriers. Had there been some flexibility, the Japanese Navy, when they went to Midway, could have had 5 fleet carriers instead of the 4, and maybe things could have gone differently for them. If you consider it, if better planning was done, additional flexibility existed in the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Second World War in the Pacific, at least at that particular turning point at Midway, could have gone in the opposite direction. Now, if the U.S. Navy had been the one to lose the majority of its carrier force that early on, the Second World War could have ended completely differently. Although that is still speculation that we should probably leave for another day. Anyways, moving back. So, Shokaku and Zuikaku would next appear at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August of 1942, clashing against the Enterprise and Saratoga. The Shokaku received minor damage, but the Enterprise took 3 bomb hits. The next significant carrier battle occurred a few months later, though, in October of 1942, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. By this time, the air wing composition had changed to be a bit more fighter-heavy, comprising 54 Zeros, 45 Vals, and 36 Kates. This battle would end up in a tactical Japanese victory, as they were able to sink the U.S. carrier Hornet and damage the Enterprise. However, strategically, Japan paid quite a heavy price. The Japanese lost 99 aircraft, 148 pilots and aircrew, including 2 dive bomber group leaders, 3 torpedo squadron leaders, 18 other flight and section leaders. Combined with the earlier battles at the Coral Sea, Midway, and Eastern Solomons, the Japanese had lost over 50% of their elite carrier aviators. This, combined with the absolute pathetic pilot training programs in Japan, meant that these aviators could not be replaced easily, and this lack of quality pilots proved disastrous during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, otherwise called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoe. Shokaku herself would be sunk during this particular battle when she was hit by torpedoes from the USS Kavala. The torpedoes were responsible for starting fires, which caused refueling planes in the hangars to explode. As the bow of the ship started to sink, a bomb rolled forward and detonated. This ignited the gas vapors, which blasted through the ship in a series of 4 large explosions. Shokaku went down in a few minutes, taking 1,263 sailors with her. Zuikaku managed to escape the Battle of the Philippine Sea with minimal damage. By this time, though, the Japanese carrier force was pretty much decimated, its most experienced pilots dead, and overall combat effectiveness was substantially lower, closer to even non-existent. Zuikaku's end came during the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. By this time, she operated pretty much as nothing more than a decoy, meant to lure American ships away from the battleships and heavy cruisers of the Imperial Navy. Eventually, U.S. carrier aircraft would locate the Zuikaku as well and would hit her with a multitude of torpedoes and bombs, sinking her on the 25th of October 1944. In literally 2 years, the Japanese Navy had one of the most feared carrier forces to start the war, and ended on a bit of a whimper, the sinking of the Zuikaku being one of the final nails in the coffin of the carrier force of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And that does it, folks, for this particular Know Your Ship episode on the Shokaku class carriers. I hope you enjoyed it. Of course, 3 little things to say before I wrap it up. 1, many thanks to my patrons. You guys are phenomenal. Thank you all so much for your continued support. Also, really big thanks for your guys' patience this time as well, because yeah, this video took a little bit longer than I thought to actually get it out. Other thing is, recently I went to a couple of small events, including Anime North, as well as I went to the Ontario Regiment Tank Museum for an event there, and I've got some pretty cool footage, so I want to show you guys that as well. That should be coming out in the next few days. Lastly, I was invited out on Tuesday by the Chieftain to HMCS Haida. They were filming something there, and I was supposed to get some footage for a behind-the-scenes video. Unfortunately, they've run into a little bit of a legal snafu there, so they're trying to work it out, and if I get permission, I will release something. If not, then my apologies, although I could probably tell you guys what happened while I was there. Aside from all that, folks, hope you all have a good one. Take care, and I'll talk to all of you again soon.